I knew this case would be dirty the moment I saw his shoes. Italian leather, perfectly polished, but with a small scuff on the left toe that suggested a man who'd been pacing nervously for hours before working up the courage to visit a private investigator. In my experience, men with expensive shoes and nervous habits usually had expensive problems that required discreet solutions, Doctor. Richard Sterling sat across from my desk in downtown Miami, his hands steady despite the circumstances. Surgeons' hands, trained not to shake even when the stakes were life and death. But there was something in his eyes that told me this wasn't about saving lives. This was about something much more personal, much more dangerous. "Mr. Hunt," he began, his voice carrying the kind of controlled authority that came from years of telling people their faces could be improved for the right price. "I need your help with a delicate situation involving my wife." Miami in August was like sitting inside someone's mouth, hot, humid, and oppressive in a way that made everyone's secrets stick to their skin like cheap cologne. I'd been running my private investigation business for 5 years, ever since my own marriage had imploded and left me with more experience in betrayal than I'd ever wanted to acquire. Doctor. Sterling was maybe 48, with silver hair that had been styled by someone who charged more per hour than most people made in a week. His suit was custom-tailored, his watch was Swiss, and his wedding ring was platinum with a diamond that caught the light every time he moved his hands. He was the kind of wealthy that didn't need to announce itself because everything about him whispered money. "What kind of delicate situation?" I asked, though I had a pretty good idea where this conversation was heading. In my experience, wealthy men who visited private investigators were usually dealing with one of 3 problems: embezzlement, blackmail, or adultery. Given the way Sterling kept fidgeting with his wedding ring, I was betting on adultery. "I suspect my wife Jessica is having an affair," he said, the words coming out like a medical diagnosis that he'd been rehearsing. "I need proof before I take any legal action." "How long have you been married?" 12 years. Jessica was a model when we met. Swimsuit campaigns, fashion shows, the kind of career that required beauty and ambition in equal measure. She gave up modeling when we married, said she wanted to focus on being a wife and building a family. "Any children?" Sterling's expression darkened slightly. "No. Jessica decided that pregnancy would interfere with her lifestyle. She's built a new career as an influencer, lifestyle blogger, that sort of thing. Very successful, actually. 500,000 followers on Instagram. I'd seen enough of these cases to know that beautiful women who married rich men often had complicated relationships with fidelity. The combination of wealth, boredom, and constant attention from admirers created situations that tested even the strongest marriages. What makes you think she's cheating?" Sterling pulled out his phone and showed me a series of photographs, restaurant bills for 2 people when Jessica claimed to be alone, credit card charges for expensive hotels during times when she was supposedly at spa appointments, and receipts for gifts that had never made it home. "She's been acting differently for the past 6 months. Secretive phone calls, unexplained absences, new clothes that she claims are for photo shoots, but that I never see her wear for work." "Any idea who the other man might be?" "I think it's Marcus Kane, her financial advisor. He's been helping her manage the income from her influencer work, setting up investment accounts, that sort of thing. But lately, their meetings seem to involve more than just financial planning." Sterling slid a business card across my desk. Marcus Kane, Private Wealth Management, with an address in Brickell that suggested he specialized in clients who had more money than they knew what to do with. "Mr. Sterling, before we proceed, I need to ask, what's your primary goal here? Do you want to save your marriage, or are you looking for ammunition for a divorce?" Sterling was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands like they contained answers to questions he wasn't sure he wanted to ask. "Mr. Hunt, I love my wife. Or at least, I love the woman I thought I married. But if Jessica is betraying our marriage, I need to know the extent of that betrayal before I decide how to respond. And if the betrayal is more extensive than just an affair, then I'll need your help with more than just gathering evidence. There was something in the way Sterling said those words that made me think this case was going to be more complicated than a simple adultery investigation. In my experience, wealthy people didn't just cheat, they schemed. And their schemes usually involved more than just bedroom betrayals. I quoted my daily rate and watched Sterling barely blink as he wrote a check for a retainer that was 3 times what most clients could afford. But as he handed me the check, I noticed something that would prove significant later. A small bandage on his left forearm, the kind that suggested recent blood work or medical testing. "Mr. Sterling, are you feeling all right? You look like you might be dealing with some health issues." "Just routine medical monitoring. When you're in the plastic surgery business, you learn to stay on top of your own health maintenance. Can't very well improve other people's appearances if you're not taking care of your own." After Sterling left, I sat in my office reviewing the case materials and trying to shake the feeling that I was missing something important. The evidence of Jessica's affair seemed almost too convenient, too well documented for someone who was supposedly being careful about hiding her activities. In my experience, people who were having affairs usually got sloppy about covering their tracks, but they rarely left evidence that was this easy to find. Either Jessica Sterling was remarkably careless about her infidelity, or someone wanted her activities to be discovered. I decided to start my investigation by learning more about Jessica Sterling's public persona. Her Instagram account was exactly what you'd expect from a former model turned lifestyle influencer. Perfectly curated photos of expensive meals, designer clothes, exotic travel destinations, and inspirational quotes about living your best life. But what caught my attention was the timeline of her posts. For someone who claimed to be building a brand around authentic lifestyle content, Jessica's social media presence seemed remarkably scripted and strategic. Every post was designed to project an image of wealth, sophistication, and happiness that felt more like advertising than personal expression. More interesting were the comments on her posts. While most of her followers seemed to be genuinely engaged with her content, there were several accounts that appeared to be fake. Profiles with no personal photos, generic usernames, and comments that were suspiciously supportive of whatever Jessica was promoting. I spent the rest of the afternoon researching Marcus Kane and his financial advisory business. On paper, Kane looked legitimate. Proper licensing, no criminal background, clients who seemed satisfied with his services. But when I dug deeper into his business model, I found some interesting patterns. Kane specialized in working with women who had recently come into significant wealth. Divorces, inheritances, insurance settlements, that sort of thing. His client list included several widows who had lost wealthy husbands under circumstances that were tragic but not suspicious, and several divorced women who had received substantial settlements from marriages that had ended acrimoniously. What was interesting was the timeline. Several of Kane's clients had experienced their windfall financial events within months of beginning to work with him. That could be coincidence, or it could suggest that Kane was more than just a financial advisor. But as I dug deeper into Kane's records, I made a mistake that would almost cost me my life. I used my real credentials to access a financial database that tracked his client transactions. What I didn't know was that Kane had monitoring systems in place to alert him whenever someone investigated his business too thoroughly. My phone rang at 8 p.m. that evening. "Mr. Hunt," said a smooth voice I didn't recognize. "I understand you've been asking questions about my business." "Who is this?" "Marcus Kane. I think we should meet. There are some things about the Sterling situation that you don't understand, and I'd hate for you to get hurt because of a misunderstanding." The threat was polite, but unmistakable. Kane knew I was investigating him, and he wanted me to know that he knew. "I'm not interested in meeting with you, Mr. Kane." "I think you are, Mr. Hunt, because if you're not, I might have to share some interesting information about your own background with certain people who would find it very illuminating." Kane had done his homework on me, too. Whatever he'd found in my past, he thought it was enough to control me. "What kind of information?" "The kind that might interest the IRS or the Florida Department of Professional Regulation, or perhaps Mrs. Catherine Murphy, whose husband you've been investigating for adultery while neglecting to mention that her husband is paying you double your normal rate to fabricate evidence of her infidelity." That last accusation was completely false, but Kane had constructed it cleverly enough that it would be difficult to disprove quickly. He was showing me that he could destroy my reputation and my business if I continued to interfere with his operations. "What do you want, Kane?" "I want you to stop investigating the Sterling marriage and close your case. Tell Dr. Sterling that his suspicions are unfounded, collect your fee, and move on to your next client. And if I don't, then you'll discover that investigating dangerous people can be dangerous for the investigator." 6 months earlier. The first meeting. The meeting between Jessica Sterling and Marcus Kane hadn't happened by accident. Kane had been watching her social media for weeks, studying her posts, analyzing her lifestyle, and identifying the financial pressure points that made her vulnerable to his particular brand of assistance. Kane's initial approach was always the same. He positioned himself as a financial advisor who specialized in helping influencers and content creators manage their income streams. His office in Brickell was designed to impress. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Biscayne Bay, expensive art on the walls, and furniture that whispered success without shouting about it. "Mrs. Sterling," Kane had said during their first meeting, his voice carrying the kind of smooth confidence that came from years of manipulating people for profit, "I've been following your work, and I'm impressed by what you've built, but I think we can do much better." Jessica had been flattered by the attention. Her Instagram success felt fragile, constantly threatened by algorithm changes and the need to maintain an image that was becoming increasingly expensive to sustain. "What do you mean by much better?" she'd asked, settling into the leather chair across from Kane's mahogany desk. "I mean turning your influence into real wealth, not just sponsorship deals and affiliate marketing, but serious money. Investment accounts, tax shelters, the kind of financial security that doesn't depend on maintaining a perfect image every day." What Kane didn't mention was that Jessica's financial situation was worse than she was willing to admit, even to herself. The lifestyle she projected on social media required constant investment. Designer clothes, exotic travel, expensive restaurants, luxury goods that generated content but also generated debt. Jessica had been using credit cards and personal loans to maintain her image, always believing that the next big sponsorship deal would solve her financial problems. But the debt was growing faster than her income, and she was approaching a crisis that would be impossible to hide from her wealthy husband. "I'm interested," Jessica had said, though she was already wondering how much Kane's services would cost and whether she could afford them. "Excellent. Let me ask you something, Mrs. Sterling. How much do you know about your husband's financial arrangements? Life insurance, investment accounts, retirement planning?" The question had seemed innocent enough, but it was the first step in Kane's systematic process of turning wives into widows and clients into accomplices. "Richard handles most of our financial planning. I know he has substantial life insurance through his practice, and we have joint accounts for household expenses, but he manages the investments. That's very common in marriages where one spouse has a high-income profession. But it also means that if something happened to Richard, you might not have full access to the financial resources you'd need to maintain your lifestyle." Kane let the implication hang in the air between them. Not pushing, just planting a seed that would grow over the following weeks as Jessica's debt situation became increasingly desperate. "I hadn't really thought about it that way," Jessica admitted. "Most people don't. They assume that love and loyalty will solve financial problems, but the reality is that money solves financial problems. Everything else is just sentiment." Over the following months, Kane had slowly drawn Jessica deeper into his web, providing her with legitimate financial advice that helped her manage her influencer income while gradually introducing ideas that were less legitimate and infinitely more dangerous. "You know, Jessica," Kane had said during their fourth meeting, "I've been thinking about your debt situation. There might be alternative solutions we haven't discussed." "What kind of alternative solutions?" Kane had opened his desk drawer and pulled out a small bottle with a medical label. "This is digitalis. It's a legitimate cardiac medication, but in certain doses and circumstances it can be very useful for solving problems that seem unsolvable." Jessica had stared at the bottle, understanding immediately what Kane was suggesting, but not quite believing it. "Marcus, are you suggesting that I'm suggesting that you consider all your options. Richard is a surgeon. He works with dangerous equipment, performs risky procedures, handles medications that could be dangerous if misused. Accidents happen in medical settings all the time." "How do you even get something like that?" Kane had smiled. "Jessica, I have clients who work in hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, medical research facilities. When you help enough people solve their financial problems, they become very grateful and very willing to help you solve other people's problems." What Kane didn't mention was that his network included corrupt doctors, nurses, and pharmacists who were willing to provide dangerous substances in exchange for financial benefits or blackmail compliance. He had spent years building relationships with medical professionals who could supply whatever was needed for his murder schemes. I love Richard." "Of course you do. But love doesn't solve debt problems, Jessica. Love doesn't prevent bankruptcy or financial ruin. Richard's death would solve your immediate problems and provide you with the resources to build whatever life you want." Kane had let the idea percolate for weeks before introducing the next phase of his plan. "Jessica, I want you to meet someone who was in a similar situation to yours." The woman Kane introduced was Linda Morrison, the widow whose husband David had described to me. Linda was beautiful, well-dressed, and radiating the kind of confidence that came from financial security. "Jessica," Linda had said over lunch at an expensive restaurant in Coral Gables, "Marcus helped me transition from a woman who was trapped in an unhappy marriage to a woman who has complete control over her own life." "How?" "By showing me that sometimes the people we love aren't the people who love us back. My husband was planning to divorce me, leave me with nothing, and marry his young secretary. Marcus helped me understand that I had other options." Linda's story was carefully crafted to make murder seem like self-defense rather than aggression. Kane always portrayed his clients as victims who were being forced to protect themselves rather than predators who were choosing to kill for profit. The next morning, I began surveillance of Jessica Sterling. She lived in a waterfront mansion in Coral Gables that probably cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. The house was surrounded by high walls, electronic gates, and security cameras that suggested the Sterlings valued their privacy. Jessica emerged from her house at 10 a.m., driving a white Range Rover that was spotless, expensive, and perfectly suited to her image as a successful lifestyle influencer. She was beautiful in the way that money could buy. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, perfect clothes that had been chosen to photograph well in any lighting. But there was something about Jessica's demeanor that struck me as artificial, like someone who was always performing for an invisible audience. Even when she was alone in her car, she maintained the kind of perfect posture and facial expression that suggested she never stopped being aware of how she looked. I followed Jessica to a boutique shopping center in Coconut Grove, where she spent 2 hours browsing stores that sold clothes most people couldn't afford to look at, let alone buy. She bought several outfits, a pair of shoes that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and a handbag that was small enough to be useless but expensive enough to make a statement. But what caught my attention was how Jessica paid for her purchases, not with credit cards that would leave a paper trail, but with cash. Lots of cash. More cash than most people carried for routine shopping, and certainly more cash than someone would need unless they were trying to avoid creating records of their spending. After shopping, Jessica drove to a small cafe in Coconut Grove, where she met Marcus Kane for what appeared to be a business lunch. Kane was exactly what I'd expected from his professional photographs. Tall, handsome, with the kind of carefully casual appearance that suggested he'd spent significant time and money on looking effortlessly attractive. I positioned myself at a table where I could observe their interaction without being obvious about it. What I saw was not what I'd expected from an illicit romantic relationship. Jessica and Kane sat across from each other like business associates rather than lovers. They kept their voices low, frequently referenced documents that Kane had brought in a briefcase, and maintained the kind of professional distance that suggested their relationship was more about business than pleasure. But the most interesting part of their conversation was how often they checked their phones and looked around the cafe like they were worried about being observed. Not the behavior of people who were discussing investment strategies, but the behavior of people who were planning something that required secrecy. I was able to photograph them together and capture some of their conversation using a directional microphone, though most of what I heard was too fragmented to be useful. What I did hear suggested they were discussing timelines, logistics, and contingency plans. The kind of conversation that suggested something more complex than an affair. "The timeline needs to be accelerated," I heard Kane saying. "Richard is asking too many questions about his health symptoms." "I've been careful with the doses," Jessica replied, her voice barely audible, even with the directional microphone. "But you're right, he's getting suspicious." Then we move to the final phase. The surgical procedure next week provides the perfect opportunity. After their lunch, Jessica and Kane walked to their cars separately, but not before Kane handed Jessica a small package that she quickly put in her purse. The exchange was quick, discreet, and obviously something they didn't want witnessed. That evening, despite Kane's threats, I decided to conduct night surveillance of the Sterling residence. Something about Jessica's behavior during the day had suggested that her most important activities might happen after dark, when she thought she was safe from observation. I positioned myself in an unmarked van across the street from the Sterling mansion, using night vision equipment to monitor the house's windows and entrances. The neighborhood was quiet, expensive, the kind of place where suspicious activity would be noticed and reported quickly. Around midnight, Jessica emerged from the house, carrying what appeared to be a small bag. She walked to her Range Rover, but instead of driving away immediately, she spent several minutes checking the street for signs of surveillance. I held my breath as Jessica's gaze swept past my van. For a moment I thought she'd spotted me, but she eventually got into her car and drove away. I waited 30 seconds before following, keeping my distance and using the van's advanced tracking equipment to maintain surveillance without getting too close. Jessica drove to a 24-hour pharmacy in South Beach, where she used cash to purchase what appeared to be medical supplies: syringes, alcohol wipes, small bottles that could have contained medication or other substances. The pharmacist seemed to know her, suggesting this wasn't her first late-night visit. After leaving the pharmacy, Jessica drove to Kane's office building in Brickell. But as I followed her into the parking garage, I realized I'd made a critical mistake. Kane was waiting for me. His Mercedes was parked in a position that blocked the garage exit, and two men in dark suits were standing near the elevator. This wasn't a coincidence. Kane had expected me to follow Jessica, and he'd prepared a trap. I considered backing out of the garage, but another car had pulled in behind me, cutting off my escape route. I was surrounded, with nowhere to run, and no easy way to call for help. Kane approached my van with the confident stride of someone who held all the advantages. "Mr. Hunt," he said, tapping on my window, "I thought we had an understanding." I rolled down the window, keeping my hands visible and trying to project more confidence than I felt. "We do have an understanding, Kane. I understand that you're a murdering psychopath, and you understand that I'm going to expose you." Kane smiled, but there was nothing friendly about the expression. "Mr. Hunt, you're in a parking garage with three men who have no qualms about violence, and no one knows where you are. This would be an excellent time to reconsider your position. If anything happens to me, the police will know exactly where to look." "Will they?" "Because I have security footage showing you following my client to a pharmacy and then to my office building. If something unfortunate happens to you here, it will look like you were stalking an innocent woman and got yourself into a dangerous situation." Kane's plan was sophisticated. He'd manipulated me into a position where my death would look like the result of my own reckless behavior rather than murder. "What do you want, Kane?" "I want you to drive out of this garage, go home, and forget that you ever heard the names Marcus Kane or Jessica Sterling. I want you to tell Dr. Sterling that his wife is faithful, close your case, and never think about any of us again. And if I don't, then you'll never leave this garage alive." One of Kane's men had moved to the front of my van, while the other had positioned himself near the driver's side door. They were professionals, ex-military or security contractors who knew how to handle situations like this without leaving evidence. I had two choices: agree to Kane's demands and hope he would let me live, or try to escape and probably get killed in the process. "I need time to think about this," I said, stalling while I tried to identify any possible escape routes. "You have 30 seconds, Kane replied, checking his watch. That's when I noticed something that gave me hope. A security camera mounted on the garage wall, its red recording light blinking steadily. If Kane killed me here, there would be video evidence of his involvement. "Kane, you're making a mistake. Killing me won't solve your problems. It will just create new ones. 15 seconds, Mr. Hunt." I made my decision. Instead of trying to negotiate further, I gunned the van's engine and drove straight at the man blocking my path. He dove out of the way as I crashed through the wooden gate that separated the parking garage from the street. The van's windshield spiderwebbed from the impact, but I could see well enough to navigate the empty streets of downtown Miami. Behind me, I could hear the sound of Kane's Mercedes starting up, followed by the roar of engines as his men began pursuit. What followed was a high-speed chase through the darkened streets of Miami, with Kane's men trying to force me off the road while I desperately tried to reach the police station downtown. The van was heavier and more powerful than their cars, but they were better drivers, and they knew the city better than I did. I managed to stay ahead of them for about 10 minutes, weaving through traffic and running red lights while calling 911 on my cell phone. But as I approached the police station, one of Kane's men managed to ram my van from the side, sending me spinning into a light pole. The impact left me dazed but conscious. As Kane's men approached my van, I could see police cars responding to my 911 call, their sirens wailing in the distance. Kane's men saw the police cars too, and they made the smart decision to retreat rather than risk being caught at the scene of an assault. But not before Kane himself approached my van one final time. "This was a warning, Mr. Hunt," he said through my broken window. "Next time, there won't be any police coming to save you." Using the van's long-range listening equipment, I was able to capture most of their conversation. "Did you get everything?" Kane asked. Yes, but I don't like doing this in public places. What if someone sees us? No one's going to see us. And even if they did, we're just a financial advisor meeting with a client. There's nothing illegal about that. Marcus, I'm scared. What if Richard figures out what we're doing before we can finish? Richard won't figure out anything because he trusts you. That's what makes this plan so perfect. He'll never suspect that his loving wife is the one who's been poisoning him. There it was, confirmation that Jessica had been poisoning her husband and that Kane was not just aware of it but actively encouraging it. The digitalis is working, but slowly, Jessica continued. Richard's been having symptoms, but not severe enough to require hospitalization. That's intentional. We need his health to decline gradually so that when he dies during the surgical procedure, it looks like a medical complication rather than murder. And you're sure this will work? I'm sure because I've done it before. 6 times, to be exact. And all 6 of my previous clients are now wealthy widows who are very grateful for my assistance. Kane's admission was chilling. He wasn't just helping Jessica plan her husband's murder. He was a serial killer who had perfected a system for manipulating wives into murdering their husbands. What about the other women? Are they still... They're still alive, if that's what you're asking. And they're all living very comfortable lives thanks to their husbands' life insurance policies and the investment strategies I've helped them implement. Kane handed Jessica another small package, similar to the one he'd given her at the cafe. This is the final component, potassium chloride in a concentrated solution. When you add this to Richard's IV during the surgical procedure, he'll experience immediate cardiac arrest. It will appear that he suffered a heart attack during his own operation. How do I explain being in the operating room? You volunteer to assist. Tell Richard you're interested in learning more about his work, that you want to be more involved in his professional life. He'll be flattered by your attention. And afterwards? Afterwards, you're a grieving widow who inherits Richard's substantial assets plus a $5 million life insurance policy. I help you manage the financial transition, you pay my fee, and we both move on with our lives. I had heard enough to confirm that Sterling was in immediate danger, but I also needed more evidence to ensure that both Jessica and Kane would be convicted. I decided to maintain surveillance while also alerting Sterling to the immediate threat to his life. The next morning I called Sterling and arranged an emergency meeting. But before that meeting I needed to gather more evidence about Kane's previous crimes. Using the information I'd gathered from his client records, I identified 3 families whose wealthy patriarchs had died under suspicious circumstances after their wives began working with Kane. My first interview was with David Morrison, whose father had died 18 months earlier during what was supposed to be routine heart surgery. The death had been ruled accidental, but David had always been suspicious about the circumstances. Mr. Morrison, I'm investigating Marcus Kane in connection with a case involving potential insurance fraud. I understand that your stepmother worked with Kane shortly before your father's death. David's expression hardened. Mr. Hunt, I've been waiting for someone to ask questions about Kane for over a year. My father was in perfect health before he started working with that woman, and within 6 months he was dead. What woman? My stepmother, Linda. She married my father 3 years ago, convinced him to change his will and increase his life insurance, and then introduced him to Marcus Kane for financial planning. 6 months later, my father was dead and Linda inherited everything. Did you report your suspicions to the police? I tried, but there was no evidence of foul play. The doctors said my father died of complications during surgery, cardiac arrest that couldn't be prevented. But Mr. Hunt, my father was a marathon runner. He had the heart of a man 20 years younger. Where is Linda now? Living in a mansion in Fisher Island, traveling the world, spending my father's money. And still working with Marcus Kane, as far as I know. The pattern was becoming clear. Kane targeted wealthy men whose wives were financially vulnerable, provided those wives with the means and methods to kill their husbands, and then helped them manage the inheritance while taking a substantial fee for his services. My second interview was with Patricia Chen, whose brother had died 2 years earlier under similar circumstances. Her brother's wife had also worked with Kane, had also been present during a medical procedure that resulted in unexpected death, and had also inherited substantial assets that Kane helped her manage. Ms. Chen, did your brother's wife show any signs of distress after his death? That's what was so disturbing, Mr. Hunt. Rebecca seemed almost relieved when Thomas died. She claimed to be grieving, but she was making financial decisions and planning her future before we'd even held the funeral. Did she continue working with Kane after your brother's death? For about a year. Then she moved to California, and I lost touch with her. But I heard through mutual friends that she remarried another wealthy man who had significant health problems shortly after their wedding. The picture was becoming increasingly clear. Kane wasn't just helping individual women kill their husbands. He was running a systematic operation that turned vulnerable wives into serial killers and wealthy widows into repeat customers. When Sterling arrived at my office that afternoon, he looked like a man who had been preparing himself for bad news. But even he wasn't prepared for what I had discovered. Dr. Sterling, your wife and Marcus Kane are planning to kill you during your surgical procedure next week. Sterling's face went white, but his hands remained steady, the hands of a surgeon trained to function under pressure. What evidence do you have? I played the recordings I'd captured during Jessica and Kane's midnight meeting, watching Sterling's expression change from shock to anger to something that looked like professional determination. Mr. Hunt, Sterling stopped, his surgeon's confidence faltering for the first time since I'd met him. I want to catch them in the act. But what if we're wrong? What if I'm destroying my marriage based on misinterpretation? Doctor, Sterling, we have recordings of them discussing your murder. But what if Jessica is being coerced? What if Kane is threatening her, forcing her to participate in something she doesn't want to do? Sterling's voice carried the desperation of a man who still loved his wife, despite the evidence of her betrayal. What if I expose this plan and discover that Jessica was trying to protect me, not kill me? It was a painful conversation to witness. A brilliant man wrestling with the reality that his wife wanted him dead. Doctor, I understand this is difficult, but we also need to discuss Kane's threats against me. He called last night and made it clear that continuing this investigation puts both of us in danger. Sterling's demeanor changed immediately. What kind of threats? He knows I'm investigating him, and he's prepared to destroy my reputation and my business if I don't back off. He also implied that physical harm might be involved if I continue. Mr. Hunt, if Kane is threatening you because of my case, then I'm responsible for putting you in danger. Maybe we should— No, I interrupted. Kane's threats confirm that we're on the right track. Innocent people don't threaten investigators. Guilty people do. But Sterling's doubts weren't easily dismissed. What if Jessica dies during this sting operation? What if something goes wrong and she's hurt, and I'm responsible for destroying the woman I love? Dr. Sterling, the woman you love is planning to kill you. The Jessica who's participating in this murder plot isn't the woman you married. She's someone who's been corrupted by greed and manipulation. Sterling was quiet for a long moment, studying his hands like they contained answers to questions he wasn't sure he wanted to ask. Mr. Hunt, I've spent my career saving lives. The idea of setting a trap that could result in Jessica's death, even to save my own life, goes against everything I believe in. Then we make sure the trap protects everyone, you, Jessica, and me. We gather evidence, We prevent the murder, and we let the justice system determine what happens to Jessica and Kane. But Sterling had more to tell me, information that made the case even more urgent and dangerous. Mr. Hunt, there's something I haven't told you. I've suspected for several weeks that Jessica has been poisoning me. That's why I've been having blood work done. I wanted to confirm my suspicions before I approached you. What did the blood work show? Traces of digitalis, a cardiac medication that I don't take and that could be dangerous in the doses that were found in my system. Why didn't you tell me this when you first hired me? Because I wanted to make sure that I was right about Jessica's intentions before I accused her of attempted murder, and because I wanted your help in gathering evidence that would hold up in court. Sterling pulled out a folder containing medical records, laboratory reports, and what appeared to be a detailed timeline of his symptoms correlated with Jessica's activities. Mr. Hunt, I don't just want to expose Jessica's plan. I want to turn it against her. I want her to think she's succeeding while we document everything she's doing, so that when she's arrested, the evidence will be overwhelming. We spent the next 2 hours developing a strategy that would allow us to catch Jessica and Kane in the act, while protecting Sterling from actual harm. The approach we settled on involved Sterling continuing his normal routine while wearing concealed recording devices, installing hidden cameras in their home and his surgical suite, and coordinating with law enforcement to ensure that Jessica and Kane could be arrested at the moment they attempted murder. Over the following days, as we prepared our trap for Jessica and Kane, I continued researching Kane's background and methods. What I discovered was a man who had turned psychological manipulation into a profitable business model. Kane's approach was sophisticated and systematic. He identified women who were financially vulnerable, either through debt, divorce, or dependence on wealthy husbands, and then gradually convinced them that murder was a reasonable solution to their problems. His method involved several stages. First, he established himself as a legitimate financial advisor, providing real services that helped his clients manage their money. This created trust and dependency. Second, he gradually introduced the idea that their financial problems could be solved through their husbands' deaths, framing murder as a form of financial planning rather than a crime. Third, he provided the means and methods for killing their husbands, including detailed instructions on how to make murder look like accident or natural death. Fourth, he helped them manage the financial aftermath, taking substantial fees while ensuring that his clients remained dependent on his services. Finally, he protected himself through careful documentation and legal structures that made it difficult to prove his involvement, even if his clients were caught. Kane had been operating for at least 5 years, and by my count, he had been involved in the murders of at least 7 wealthy men. He was not just a financial advisor. He was a predator who specialized in turning wives into killers and marriages into murder schemes. The following week, Sterling's surgical procedure was scheduled for a Thursday morning. The operation was minor, removal of a small skin lesion that could be performed in his office under local anesthesia. Jessica had volunteered to assist, claiming she wanted to learn more about Sterling's work. Unknown to Jessica, every surface in Sterling's surgical suite had been equipped with hidden cameras, and Sterling was wearing a concealed recording device that would capture every word of their conversation. I had also coordinated with Detective Maria Santos of the Miami PD, who had agreed to assist with the sting operation despite her initial skepticism about our evidence. "Dr. Hunt," Detective Santos said as we positioned ourselves in a surveillance van outside Sterling's office building, "I hope you're right about this. If we're wrong, we're about to arrest a woman for attempted murder based on conversations that could be interpreted as normal business discussions. Detective, I've been doing this for 5 years. I've never been more certain about anything in my professional life." We had also taken precautions to protect Sterling's life. The anesthesia equipment had been modified to deliver harmless saline solutions instead of any potentially dangerous substances, and emergency medical personnel were standing by in case Jessica's poisoning attempts had caused more damage than we realized. As we watched through the hidden cameras, Jessica began preparing the surgical equipment with the kind of careful attention that suggested she knew exactly what she was doing. But what she didn't know was that every movement she made was being recorded from multiple angles, and that the substances she thought she was administering were harmless. "This should help you relax, honey," Jessica said as she prepared the IV line, her voice carrying a sweetness that was chilling given what she thought she was doing. The confidence in Jessica's voice was explained by months of Kane's manipulation and reassurance. She believed that she was following a plan that had worked successfully for other women, and that her husband's death would appear to be a tragic medical accident. "What are you adding to the IV?" Sterling asked, playing his role perfectly. "Just a little something extra to help with the pain management. I've been reading about advanced techniques, and I thought this might be more effective than your usual approach." What Jessica thought she was adding was a concentrated dose of potassium chloride that would have caused cardiac arrest within minutes. In reality, she was administering harmless saline while being recorded committing attempted murder. The most disturbing aspect of watching Jessica attempt to kill her husband was her calm demeanor. She wasn't acting like someone who was being forced into murder against her will. She was acting like someone who had convinced herself that murder was a reasonable business decision. "Jessica," Sterling said, his surgeon's training allowing him to remain calm despite the circumstances, "I need to ask you something." "What is it, honey?" "The substance you just added to my IV, where did you get it?" Jessica's expression changed. Slightly, but she maintained her composure. "I got it from Marcus. He said it would help ensure that the procedure went smoothly." "And what exactly did Marcus tell you this substance would do?" "He said—" Jessica paused, perhaps beginning to realize that something was wrong. "He said it would help you relax during the surgery." "Jessica, the substance you just administered is potassium chloride. In the concentration you used, it would normally cause immediate cardiac arrest. The only reason I'm still alive is that we replaced your solution with harmless saline." Jessica's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, fear, anger, and finally, resignation. She had been caught, and she knew it. "Richard, I can explain—" "You can explain to the police." At that moment, Detective Santos and two uniformed officers entered the surgical suite. Jessica was arrested while still wearing surgical gloves, with video evidence of her attempting to administer what she believed was a lethal injection to her husband. Marcus Kane was arrested at his office the same day, where police found detailed financial plans for managing Jessica's expected inheritance, as well as evidence linking him to the suspicious deaths of several of his previous clients' husbands. Kane's office was a treasure trove of evidence. His computer contained files on dozens of women, many of whom were married to wealthy men who had experienced sudden health problems or unexpected deaths. He had documented their financial situations, their psychological vulnerabilities, and the methods he had used to convince them that murder was their best option. Most damning was Kane's client management system, a database that tracked the progress of each murder plot, including timelines for the poisoning phase, logistics for the final killing, and financial projections for managing the inheritance. Kane had kept detailed records because he believed his legal protections were sufficient to prevent prosecution, even if his clients were caught. He had structured his business through multiple shell companies and had documented his interactions with clients as financial consulting rather than murder planning. But Kane's confidence in his legal protections proved to be misplaced. The evidence we had gathered through our sting operation was overwhelming, and his own records provided a clear picture of a systematic murder-for-profit scheme. The interrogation of Jessica Sterling was one of the most psychologically complex conversations I'd ever witnessed. Detective Santos conducted the questioning with professional skill, but Jessica's responses revealed a woman who had convinced herself that murder was a reasonable solution to financial problems. Mrs. Sterling, we have video evidence of you attempting to administer a lethal dose of potassium chloride to your husband. Do you want to tell us why you tried to kill him? Jessica's first response was to deny the obvious. I wasn't trying to kill Richard. I was trying to help him with his surgical procedure. By administering a substance that would have caused immediate cardiac arrest? Marcus told me it was a new type of anesthetic. He said it would make the surgery more comfortable for Richard. Mrs. Sterling, Marcus Kane is not a doctor. He's a financial advisor. Why would you take medical advice from a financial advisor? Jessica's composure began to crack as she realized that her explanations weren't believable. You don't understand. I didn't have a choice. Marcus said this was the only way to solve our problems. What problems? Financial problems. I owe money. A lot of money. Credit cards, personal loans, business expenses. Richard doesn't know about the debt, and if he found out, he'd divorce me and I'd lose everything. So you decided to kill him instead? Marcus said it would look like an accident. He said no one would ever know what really happened and that I'd be able to pay off my debts with the life insurance money. Detective Santos pressed harder. Mrs. Sterling, did Marcus Kane tell you that he had helped other women in similar situations? Yes. He said he'd worked with several women whose husbands had died under unfortunate circumstances and that those women were now financially secure. Did it occur to you that those unfortunate circumstances might have been murder? Jessica was quiet. For a long moment, perhaps finally understanding the full extent of what she had become involved in. I tried not to think about it. Marcus made it seem like a business arrangement, not like murder. The interrogation continued for several hours, with Jessica gradually admitting to the full extent of her involvement in the plot to kill her husband. What emerged was a picture of a woman who had been systematically manipulated by Kane, but who had also made conscious choices to participate in murder for financial gain. The interrogation of Marcus Kane was equally revealing, but for different reasons. Kane was a sociopath who had developed a systematic approach to manipulating vulnerable women into committing murder for financial gain. Mr. Kane, we have evidence that you've been involved in the deaths of at least 7 wealthy men whose wives were your clients. Do you want to explain how that happened? Kane's response was chillingly calm. Detective, I'm a financial advisor. My job is to help my clients achieve their financial goals through legal and appropriate means. If some of my clients have experienced unexpected windfalls due to their husbands' deaths, that's unfortunate, but not illegal. What about the potassium chloride you provided to Jessica Sterling? I have no knowledge of any potassium chloride. Mrs. Sterling consulted with me about investment strategies for her influencer income. If she obtained dangerous substances from other sources, that's not my responsibility. Kane had clearly prepared for this possibility, but he hadn't counted on the level of evidence we'd been able to gather through our sting operation. Mr. Kane, we have recordings of you providing Jessica Sterling with detailed instructions on how to kill her husband. We have video evidence of you giving her the potassium chloride, and we have financial records showing that you've profited substantially from the deaths of your previous clients' husbands. Kane's facade began to crack when he realized the extent of the evidence against him. Those women came to me for help. I provided them with solutions to their problems. If they chose to implement those solutions in ways that resulted in their husbands' deaths, that was their choice, not mine. So you admit that you helped them plan murders? I admit that I provided financial planning services to women who were trapped in unsatisfying marriages. What they did with that advice was their decision. Detective Santos continued pressing Kane, gradually breaking down his psychological defenses and exposing the full extent of his murder-for-profit scheme. "Mr. Kane, how many women have you helped kill their husbands?" "I haven't helped anyone kill anyone. I've helped women achieve financial independence through strategic planning and investment management." Strategic planning that included murder? Strategic planning that included exploring all available options for improving their financial situations. It was a weak defense, and Kane knew it. He had been caught with overwhelming evidence, and his attempts to frame his murder schemes as legitimate financial planning were transparent and unconvincing. The trial of Jessica Sterling and Marcus Kane was one of the most sensational criminal cases in Miami's recent history. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Chen, painted a picture of calculated murder driven by greed and financial desperation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Ada Chen said in her opening statement, "this case is about two people who decided that murder was an acceptable solution to financial problems. Jessica Sterling was drowning in debt that her wealthy husband knew nothing about. Marcus Kane was a predator who specialized in manipulating vulnerable women into committing murder for profit. The defense attorneys tried various strategies: temporary insanity for Jessica, lack of direct evidence against Kane, claims that Sterling had orchestrated the entire scheme to frame his wife. But the evidence was too overwhelming, and the recordings too damning. The most powerful moment in the trial came when Sterling testified about discovering his wife's plan to kill him. "Dr. Sterling," Ada Chen asked, "what went through your mind when you realized that your wife was trying to murder you?" "I felt betrayed in a way that I hadn't known was possible," Sterling replied, his surgeon's composure intact, despite the emotional weight of his testimony. "I had trusted Jessica with my life, and she had decided that my death was worth more to her than my life." "Did you ever consider simply divorcing your wife when you suspected her infidelity?" "Yes, but when I realized that she was trying to kill me, divorce wasn't sufficient. I needed to make sure that she was stopped before she could hurt anyone else." The prosecution also called several family members of Kane's previous victims who testified about the suspicious circumstances surrounding their relatives' deaths and the financial benefits that their widows had received. David Morrison's testimony was particularly compelling. "My father was in perfect health before he married Linda and started working with Marcus Kane. Within 6 months he was dead, and Linda had inherited everything. The doctors said it was a heart attack during surgery, but my father had the heart of a man 20 years younger." The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Jessica Sterling was convicted of attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and insurance fraud. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Marcus Kane was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, racketeering, and multiple counts of accessory to murder related to his previous clients. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. 5 years after the convictions, the contrast between the lives of Dr. Sterling and his former wife could not have been more dramatic. Dr. Sterling had used the media attention from the case to build one of Miami's most successful plastic surgery practices. He established a foundation that provided free reconstructive surgery for victims of domestic violence, and 3 years after Jessica's conviction, he remarried Dr. Sarah Chen, a trauma surgeon who shared his values. Sterling and Dr. Chen had 2 children together and were active in charitable organizations. During our final conversation about the case, Sterling reflected on what he'd learned. "Mr. Hunt, working with you saved my life and taught me the difference between someone who wants to share my life and someone who wants to take my life. What would you tell other people who might be in similar situations? Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, investigate rather than hoping it will get better. And don't be afraid of the truth, even when that truth is ugly. Meanwhile, Jessica's life in prison was everything her privileged existence had not prepared her for. She was housed in a maximum security facility where her former beauty and wealth meant nothing. Jessica died in prison 3 years into her sentence, diagnosed with cancer that was probably related to the stress of incarceration. Dr. Sterling, when informed of her death, chose not to visit or offer assistance. Jessica made her choices based on greed. I'm not obligated to rescue her from the consequences. Marcus Kane received life in prison without parole. His conviction led to investigations of similar operations in other states, and several other financial advisors were arrested for running murder-for-profit schemes. 6 months after Sterling's second wedding, I received a call that reminded me why this case had been so important. "Mr. Hunt, this is Patricia Morrison. I think my husband might be trying to kill me." The voice was shaky, but determined. Mrs. Morrison's story was chillingly familiar. A wealthy husband who had recently increased her life insurance, mysterious health problems, and a financial advisor who seemed unusually interested in her personal situation. "Mrs. Morrison, can you come to my office this afternoon? What you're describing sounds very familiar, and familiarity in this business usually means danger." As I prepared for another case involving attempted domestic murder, I reflected on the lessons from Dr. Sterling's experience. Love should make you safer, not more vulnerable. Marriage should be about building a life together, not about one person destroying the other. My name is Riley Hunt, and Jessica Sterling's case taught me that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who share your bed, and that survival requires not just love and trust, but also vigilance and the courage to investigate when something feels wrong. The phone rang again before I could leave the office. "Mr. Hunt, my name is Catherine Williams. I think my husband is trying to poison me, and his financial advisor keeps asking questions about my life insurance policy." I sat back down and reached for my notebook. "Tell me everything, Mrs. Williams, and start from the beginning. Because the work never ends, and there's always someone else who needs help distinguishing between the person they married and the person who's planning to kill them."